Hey everyone, it's Tom. Today I'm going to explain why right now might actually be the best time to buy a home and provide you the data to demonstrate how to make choices right now that will help you maximize the return on your investment with your home purchase in the future. First, let me explain why I'm making this video. Recently, my wife and I were considering purchasing a second rental property, and I began to wonder that with home buying interest rates having risen over the course of 2022 to the highest that they've been in 20 years, and with low supply still keeping home values relatively high, is there a point in the future that represents the optimum time to buy? So in other words, setting aside the rental income, I wanted to try to find the best point in time to buy such that I would maximize my returns on my investment when I would go to sell the home in the future. But when I tried to answer this question of when the optimal time to buy might be, I found plenty of articles and videos on seasonal real estate trends and interest rate trends and housing market predictions over the next several years, but I couldn't find the detailed analytical information I was seeking. So I decided to just analyze the market myself, and I wrote algorithms to compute your returns on your investment for a home purchased under various assumptions in every month of every year since 1971. I wanted to try to use the historical real estate and interest rate trends to draw conclusions about today and what might happen with your investment in the future. As some people may be aware, Freddie Mac began its primary mortgage market survey in 1971. So that's the earliest year from which we have consistent mortgage rate data. And I wanted to base my analysis on the assumption that you're borrowing money to purchase a home because that represents the majority of home purchases, more than 60% of them. And I used the traditional 30-year fixed rate mortgage because there isn't data for other terms prior to the early 1990s and because that still represents the most common loan today. For the housing market, I simply took the U.S. median home values since 1971, and I assumed that if you bought a house at the median value, you could sell it at any future month for the median value. Obviously, there are market variations in different geographical areas that might increase or decrease home values in one area more than another, but I just assumed for the sake of the analysis that the median home always trades as the median home because I was looking at the market as a whole. To determine the return on investment, I summed the total cost of the loan to the homeowner over the time of ownership, assuming that the home again was purchased and sold at the median home value. I assumed a 20% traditional down payment such that the total cost of the loan include the down payment, the principal and interest paid over the time of ownership, and the closing costs incurred any time the home is refinanced. Closing costs can vary dependent upon a variety of factors specific to different parts of the country. But for the sake of this analysis, I assumed closing costs near the higher end of the scale, and I assumed that the closing costs would always be 6% of the residual loan value. And the reason I did that was to try to restrain the number of times that refinancing would make sense. And the reason for that will become apparent in a little bit. I also didn't include any taxes or homeowner's insurance or any additional expenses in my analysis because the point was to compare the costs of the loan to the sale price. I was trying to compare the return on investment in the home, not dependent upon any other expenses. I computed the returns on investment over 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25 years under different assumptions of when and how you might refinance the loan, if at all. See, refinancing is an important variable in determining how much your return on your investment might be because while the housing market has generally risen over the past 50 years, interest rates have risen and fallen, and the amount of interest you pay is inversely correlated with how quickly you can pay down the principal on the loan and therefore own more of the home. In this first plot, you can see the returns over 5 years on the median home bought in every month of every year since 1971. The green area shows the home values in the given month and year indicated along the bottom of the graph, whereas the gray area shows the home values 5 years into the future from the month and year along the bottom of the graph. The vertical scale for those areas is on the right of the graph. The black line is the trend of the percentage difference between those two values. So in other words, the trend of the percentage difference in the median home value at the time of sale from the time of purchase as a percentage of the median home value at the time of purchase. The red line at the bottom is the average 30-year fixed interest rate. The first thing that's evident in this plot is that the return on investment trends follow the trend of the percent difference in the median home values at the time of sale versus the time of purchase, which seems relatively obvious. The green, purple, magenta, and blue lines represent different refinancing scenarios. For the green line, the assumption is that you'd refinance any time the 30-year interest rate had decreased enough such that the amount of interest you'd save over the course of the remainder of the term of the loan would be greater than the closing cost you'd incur during the refinance. And once the refinance occurred, the assumption is that you'd take on another 30-year term at the new rate and continue to only pay the minimum monthly payment. This, of course, means that if you refinance the loan, say 20 years into the term, you'd end up with a total loan repayment period of 50 years. And this is why I assumed closing costs that would be near the high end of the average in order to keep the barrier to entry, quote unquote, for a refinance on the high side, as most people would not realistically refinance as many times as would be advantageous simply under the conditions that they'd save the interest over the remainder of the term. The same is true for the purple line, where the assumption is that you'd refinance any time that the interest saved over the next 5 years would be greater than the costs of the refinance. In this scenario, I wanted to see the impact of limiting refinances to only cases where you'd recover your refinance costs within the next 5 years. But like with the green line, the assumption here again is that you'd simply extend the term of the loan another 30 years each time you refinanced and would continue to just make the minimum monthly payment. The magenta trend line is notably different than the purple line in that here, the assumption is that each time you refinance, you do so not only when you'd recover the costs of the refinancing in the next 5 years, but that you'd also continue to make the same monthly payment as when you originally took out the loan, with the difference saved by the refinance always going toward the principal each month. In this scenario, the refinance is still assumed to be a 30-year fixed term at the new rate, but instead of lowering your monthly payment, the assumption is that you'd take the difference in the monthly payment provided by the refinance and put it toward the principal. In this way, you'd pay off the loan even faster than the original 30-year term, or, in other words, you'd increase your ownership of the home faster. This means that if you were 20 years into the term and the average interest rate had decreased enough that you could refinance and recover your refinance costs within the next 5 years, you'd refinance for another 30-year term, but you'd keep making the same monthly payment such that you'd actually pay the remainder of the loan off in less than 10 years. In reality, in this scenario, someone might choose to refinance with a 15-year term or another non-traditional shorter term, which would also often come with an even further reduced interest rate as an added incentive. However, to keep things comparable, using 30-year rates across all cases, I didn't include this kind of scenario. Additionally, assuming you paid the minimum monthly payment in that scenario, it wouldn't be significantly different than taking on another 30-year term but continuing to pay the same monthly payment that you had prior to refinancing. Lastly, the blue trend line represents a loan with no refinances. In other words, this assumes you stuck with the original terms of the loan throughout the entire 30-year term, paying the minimum monthly payment until the loan is paid off 30 years later or until whenever you sold the home. So as I said before, all the trends of return on investment follow the trend of the percentage difference in market value from the time of purchase to the time of sale. But what we can conclude about the different refinancing scenarios is that, well, over the course of 5 years, it's evident that for most months, refinancing doesn't provide a significant impact in terms of the return on investment. But it's notable that your returns would be worse if you refinanced each time you'd save interest over the total remainder of the term, as indicated by the green line. And that should be obvious. You'd save money overall, but saving that spread out over 30 years means that when you'd go to sell that home in 5 years, your stake in the home would be lower. If you just paid the new monthly payment, you're paying less on the principal at the same time you're paying less interest. So historically, if you bought a house and sold it 5 years later, The best time to buy was actually about 5 years ago because the market difference today is near a 50-year high, not seen since the mid-1970s. And interest rates were at historical lows at the time of purchase. But what's also noteworthy is that this doesn't mean that you would have seen the greatest returns if you had bought at the bottom of the market in 2011 because interest rates continued to fall and the market difference continued to increase from that point to today. But what happens over the course of 10 years? For the plots of returns on investment over 10 years, the trends again follow the trend of the percentage difference in home values from the time of purchase to the time of sale, as you'd expect, but you can start to see that the magenta line, which represents refinancing whenever you'd recover the cost of refinancing in 5 years, but continue to make a constant monthly payment, starts to show a significant advantage for purchase months where the interest rates were high, as in the early 1980s. In fact, that strategy would have resulted in about 40% greater returns than any of the others in 1981 and 1982. Over 10 years, we can also see that a home purchased at the bottom of the market in 2011 would have produced the highest returns in the last 50 years because even though the percentage difference in the market from the time of purchase to the time of sale was greater in the 1970s, the market difference is nearly as great from 2011 to 2021, and the interest rates were about 60% lower in 2011 than in the early 1970s. However, here's where it starts to become difficult, because we run out of forward-looking data after 2022 to project what those median homes purchased in the 2017 timeframe that we looked at in the 5-year return plot will produce in the next 10 years. In the near term, it seems obvious that the housing market is starting to dip, but it's difficult to say what the trend will look like in 2027. Looking at the plot for percentage return over 15 years, we again see that the trend follows the trend of percentage difference in home values from the time of purchase to the time of sale, but the magenta line shows even more of an advantage for the early 1980s. If you had purchased a home in the early 1980s, refinanced it whenever the interest you'd have saved over the next 5 years would have been greater than the closing costs you'd have incurred, and continued to make the same monthly payment each time you refinanced, and then sold the home after 15 years instead of 10, you would have seen 10% greater returns, now meaning that you could have recovered around 100% of your investment over those 15 years. Another thing that's notable after 15 years is that homes bought in the 2007 timeframe, right before the Great Recession, actually produced some of the best historical returns, comparable to the returns over 15 years on homes bought in the early 1990s, because of what happened to the housing market in the last couple of years when those 2007 homes would have been sold. Over 20 years, the returns on those early 1980s properties start to exceed 100% of the investment, again, assuming the buyers continued to make a constant monthly payment each time they refinanced. And homes bought closer to the mid-1980s would have returned over 150% of the investment if they were sold after 20 years because of the peak in the housing market in 2007. The effect of the decreasing interest rates can also be seen by comparing the magenta with the blue trends from the early to mid-1980s. Aside from obviously achieving a greater return on your investment if you had refinanced and maintained the same monthly payment, the magenta line also indicates that your returns would have peaked in earlier years than if you hadn't refinanced. The reason for that is that the interest rates were higher in the early 1980s but started to fall thereafter. So if you had refinanced each time you could have recovered the costs within the next 5 years, you would have had several early opportunities to refinance before paying a lot in interest during those early years of the loan. In comparison, if you had never refinanced, your returns would have peaked if you had bought in the mid-1980s when rates had already fallen to lower values. With this 20-year view, we lose the forward-looking data to be able to tell what the returns might be on homes bought at the peak of the market in 2007 before the Great Recession. But what's interesting is that when we look at the return over 25 years, we can see what happens to the returns on homes purchased at the height of interest rates in the early 1980s when those homes were sold at the peak of the market in 2007, just before the market collapse. In fact, if you had bought a house in July of 1982 with 20% down and a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, refinance the loan each time, you would have saved more in interest over the next 5 years than the closing costs, but continue to pay your original monthly payment over the remainder of the term, and then sold that house 25 years later in July of 2007, that sale would have returned about 190% of what you had paid on the home in those 25 years, which is only slightly lower than the historic high of 210% for homes bought in the early 1970s. Here, the difference between refinancing under these conditions and never refinancing becomes great. First, if you had consistently refinanced each time, you would have saved more in interest over the next 5 years than the cost you would have incurred in the refinance, but continue to pay your original monthly payment over the remainder of the term, your returns would have never been below 99% of your investment. And second, the difference between your returns on a home purchased in the early 1980s, if you had refinanced under these conditions, versus never refinancing could have been as much as 110%, as seen in October of 1981. If we look at a plot of all the returns on investment over 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25 years together, we can see that the average returns increased by about 50% over the same period of time. Again, assuming that we refinance but continue to pay the same monthly payment over the term. Since we have only forward-looking data for the 25-year returns up to late 1997, we can only compare over the time period from 1971 through 1997. What's noteworthy is that while the average returns increase, the range of possible returns doesn't really change. So whether you sold a home 5 years after you purchase or 25 years after you purchase, the range of possible returns you could see on your investment would have been the same dependent on the combination of month of purchase and month of sale. In other words, the longer you keep a home, the better chance you have of at least recovering your investment, but there is negligible difference on the range of returns you could expect. Over 5 years, you could have recovered as much as 173% or as little as 51% of your investment. But over 25 years, you could have recovered as much as 218% or as little as 99%. In both cases, the max return would have been about 120% greater than the minimum return. So what do you need to know based on this data about the best time to buy a home? Well, first, the combination of when you buy and when you sell has the biggest impact on your return on your investment. And assuming you're borrowing money to buy a home, those factors can completely offset the impact of your initial interest rate, especially if you take advantage of refinancing as an opportunity to put more toward the principal in the future. While interest rates seem high now, they're historically relatively low, and there's always the chance that they could dip lower in the future, which would permit you to take advantage of refinancing. And while some may claim that homes are still currently relatively overvalued, it isn't necessarily a bad thing to buy near the peak of the market if you also sell near the peak of the market. Take, for example, a home purchased in mid-2007 near the peak of the housing market but sold in mid-2022. Your returns over that 15 years could have been about 35% greater than a home purchased just a couple years earlier in 2005 but sold in 2020. Another thing to point out is that keeping your home longer improves the chances of at least recovering your investment. And assuming that you can choose the time to sell, you can choose that time to guarantee that. Even the best housing market predictions can't predict what will happen in 10 plus years, and most people agree that you shouldn't purchase a home that you don't plan to keep for at least 7 to 10 years. So while now may appear to be a relative peak in the market, there's no guarantee that when you go to sell your 2023 home in 2033 or 2038, that it won't be another peak in the market. With that said, thanks everyone for watching. If you found this helpful, please hit the like button down below and consider subscribing, and I'll post more content like this. And let me know in the comments section what other types of videos you'd like to see. Until next time.